Hello everyone! Today we'll be doing a run through of a Procreate piece that I did. It's actually a redrawing of something that I did in 2018, right when Spider-Verse came out. I really wanted to play with perspective and like actually practice perspective this time around. The previous picture I used 1-point perspective, and this time I wanted to use 2-point perspective. And since I've recently started using Procreate over the past year, I noticed that they have a perspective guideline to help you with point perspective, which I definitely took advantage of in this video and in this drawing, because perspective is hard and I don't think I'll ever be a pro at it, but I am getting better at it. So you can see I'm just roughing in some buildings and characters. It's truly a bold move of me to interlace characters, but also in a perspective background. You know, we do what we can, but I really wanted to try to make this more organic and more like in a scene, as opposed to just like a snapshot of like an individual person with like nothing going on around them. And if you haven't seen Spider-Verse, I definitely recommend it. It's on Netflix. Beautiful animation. It like moves like how a comic book would, and I think that that is really cool. And they developed a whole new system to create that animation. Would definitely recommend it. Here I am doing the old lady. Wanted to have some more movement, as in like walking across the street, and like a little bit more different posing, as well as some street lamps, because I didn't do that in my past one, but it takes place in New York, so there's a lot going on the streets. And then I realized that I couldn't have a street scene without more people in it, because New York is always happening. There's always people around. So I played with planes and put more people in the foreground. Not to necessarily block any people in the background, but that's just sort of how it worked. And it also, I think, aided in where it like framed Miles and the old lady. And here you can see I'm lining. I tried something where I lined the most forefront buildings on like one layer and then lowered the opacity, and then kept lowering the opacity as I went backwards in space. Fire escapes are very hard to draw, but we eventually got there. But I think adding the like opacity settings and like lowering them as I went farther back aided in creating the space and giving it more depth. Wow, I really struggled with this fire escape. I remember now. I drew this like a month ago, and I'm finally getting around to uploading the playback. But I also remembered I really struggled with the forefront characters. And I heavily referenced a actual fire escape and tried to create the perspective that I was going for. But a lot of trial and error. And then at some point I think I realized that I'm like, oh, this is in the background. It'll be less noticeable because there will be things in front of it and motion and all of that good stuff. So I tried to remember that. But I also tried to not let myself remember that, if that makes sense, because I feel like I tend to lack in the detail department when it comes to backgrounds, because I'm like, oh, nobody will see it. I don't have to try as hard, which is something I want to get away from. I want to create a space where you can clearly see what it is, but it was very thoughtfully minimalized, if that makes sense. Like not drawing every individual brick of each building, or and just like giving the inference of more bricks. The perspective lines really came in handy for the windows as well as the back buildings. I really struggled with the windows. But in the foreground building, I added some individual bricks because they were closer, and we wouldn't see as many of them because of the person in the foreground. And then just doing some theater type things just to create a little bit more interesting, as opposed to everything is flat facing the street, giving it a little more depth. And also trying to be as like thin as possible with my line work the further I went back, to again create that space of it like being an actual thing that maybe you couldn't walk into, but like you can see the depth of it. And I think that that is more seeable in a 2-point perspective as opposed to a 1-point perspective. And I also did all of these planes on different layers so I could continue to reference each layer as I lined a new layer. And it looks really messy right now, but it gets better, I promise. And then here I start lining Miles and the old lady. I really enjoy Miles's costuming in the movie. I think it's very, because he's 13, it makes a lot of sense that he is in baggy, comfy clothes, doesn't tie his shoes, has his hood up a lot. I wanted to give him patches on his hoodie, but they wouldn't translate very well, and they were just a little too far away for it to like be worth it, but you know, that's okay. I also really struggled with the feet perspective of this, but you know, sometimes you fake it till you make it, and then it ends up looking okay. I do really like how the old woman turned out. I added a lot more wrinkles than I did in her previous iteration, and like just a lot more like liver spots and just like telltale signs of like having lived a life. So like more wrinkles, more liver spots, just more coloring in certain places. And I also, in my last drawing, I gave her slippers, and I'm like, that's not practical for walking and doing groceries. So I gave her actual shoes this time, which I think was appropriate. And then I went in with the foreground characters. I wanted to keep them as ambiguous as possible because I wanted to do a Gaussian blur at the end of it, so I didn't really need a lot of detail because they weren't the main focus, even though they're the closest to the viewer. I really struggled with the figure on the left. I couldn't figure out how to make it work. I also definitely redlined this car because I cannot draw cars, and it is okay. It's fine. It really is okay. You can redline and use references. Don't let anybody tell you that you can't. As long as you don't claim things as your own, I think is the important lesson to take away from that. But I really struggled with this left-hand character. Like I said, I tried a couple of different poses, but I didn't want to cover up Miles too much, so I was struggling on where to place him. And then I finally settled on just like the back of a dude's head. And then I went into each individual field or plane and grayscaled them so I could figure out like where everything was. And I think this is the first time I think I've done this, and I think it really helped for my reference for like coloring. And also I could just do a layer mask on them, and everything was already masked, which I think was really helpful. But yeah. Then I'm referencing my old art as well as some official art so I can pick and choose colors correctly. And I can superimpose my old art. You can sort of see it in the middle here. But I I think doing flats is my favorite part of any process. I think it just sort of, you can see it come to life from lines. I think sketching is more fluid and expressive, but I think, and lining I think is very, I don't want to say limiting, but it just like locks things in place, and then doing the flat color brings it back, which I think is fun. I like seeing that come to life. I also gave Grandma a little matching outfit. I thought that was cute. And for the colors in the buildings, I didn't want to make it so cartoony that it was just like red and brown, like just very saturated, but I also didn't want to make it like one color or like muted grays. So I tried to keep everything in the same tone, but like, which means like less saturated, and it like works together more as opposed to just throwing random colors on there. And I really struggled with the skyscraper in the back, with the reflection, because usually skyscrapers are all glass, and I could not for the life of me figure out how to do it, and so I just like did it, and I was like, this will be fine. This will be fine. And then shadowing is coming in at this point. Again, using a clipping mask and using, I was going to say I used a red, but I clearly used a navy blue to shade. And I want to get better at cell shading, and I get scared committing to it, I guess. Like I always tend to blend it out more than I need to. And I want to push myself in order to like keep the shadows where they are, as crisp as they are, and really giving it that depth that it wants and that I want it to have. But yeah, this is pretty much me just finishing up with more shadows, a little bit of highlighting, and then going around Miles and the old lady to make them pop even more, against like the Gaussian blur as well as the overlay, because I didn't want them to blend into the background too much, but I also wanted to make sure that they fit in the world in which they lived. And then me referencing the Spanish that I used for the other one. It just says, kiddo, your shoes are untied, and then Miles goes, yeah, it's a choice, because he says that a lot in the movie. But I really hope you enjoyed this walkthrough, and I'll post a picture at the end. Bye!